What happens when the most powerful families in medieval Europe decide to keep it all in the family for centuries? Forget fairy tales, this is a real-life horror story of deformed kings, infertile empires, and entire dynasties collapsing under their own twisted bloodlines. From the infamous Habsburg jaw to a bleeding prince who helped spark a revolution, this is the dark side of royal legacy no one talks about. Stick around, because the ugliest secret of medieval power isn't war, famine, or betrayal. It's family. Ever wondered what would happen if your entire family tree looked more like a wreath? In medieval Europe, that was less a hypothetical and more a dynastic strategy. Royalty wasn't just obsessed with power, they were obsessed with keeping it. And to them, the best way to lock it down was to marry within their own bloodline. It sounds like a plot twist from a bad soap opera, but for centuries, the elite genuinely believed that marrying your cousin, or even your niece, wasn't just acceptable, it was politically brilliant. But here's the twist, that brilliance came at a brutal cost. Because once you've kept interbreeding for long enough, the bill comes due, and it's paid in deformities, madness, and dynasties crumbling under their own genetic weight. Let's zoom in on one of the most infamous examples, the Habsburgs. This powerful family ruled chunks of Europe for centuries: Austria, Spain, Burgundy, parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. But behind the gold and glory was a secret rotting the dynasty from the inside out. Generation after generation, Habsburg kings and queens married their uncles, nieces, and first cousins so consistently that by the time you get to Charles II of Spain, you're basically looking at a walking family tree in human form. Charles II was the tragic, almost cartoonish endpoint of the centuries-long inbreeding project. He was born with a massive jaw so oversized that he couldn't chew his food properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing speech issues. He was intellectually delayed, physically frail, and, oh yeah, he couldn't father an heir. All of this, not random. It was genetic Russian roulette that the Habsburgs kept playing and losing. Modern studies have shown Charles II had a higher inbreeding coefficient than the offspring of a brother-sister union. That's not speculation. It's been confirmed by geneticists analyzing 16 generations of Habsburg intermarriage. They traced the family lineage back and discovered that almost 90% of Charles's ancestors were also related to each other. This wasn't just some medieval fluke, it was deliberate. The idea was to prevent lands and titles from leaking out of the family. But the irony is delicious. By clinging so tightly to power, they essentially doomed themselves to extinction. After Charles II died without an heir in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg line collapsed, dragging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. It wasn't just tragic, it was geopolitically catastrophic. And this wasn't just a Habsburg problem. All across medieval Europe, noble bloodlines played this deadly genetic lottery. The Capetians in France, the Ptolemies in Egypt, yes, Cleopatra married her own brothers, and even some Anglo-Saxon houses flirted with cousin marriages. Why? Because in a world without paternity tests or clear succession laws, keeping royal blood pure was seen as the only way to ensure your kids inherited the throne. Now pause and compare this to today. In most countries, cousin marriage is discouraged, if not outright illegal. Genetic counseling is common. The average person knows that marrying a close relative significantly ups the risk of recessive disorders. But in medieval courts, the more interlinked your pedigree, the more legitimate your claim to rule. It's like someone flipped logic on its head. Take a moment and imagine this happening today. It would be the equivalent of a presidential family announcing that their son is marrying his aunt to consolidate political control. Public outrage, instant. Legal barriers, immense. Memes, endless. But in medieval Europe, it was par for the course. And the consequences weren't just physical or medical, they were cultural and psychological. Many royal families developed intense paranoia, partly fueled by their own bloodlines collapsing. They saw enemies in every shadow, traitors in every cousin, and their court politics grew so convoluted that betrayal became an art form. You weren't just fighting your enemies, you were usually married to them. Even the church, which technically forbade incest, often looked the other way. Papal dispensations were handed out like candy if the union brought more power or land to the table. The irony: the church often benefited from these dynastic unions through tithes, donations, or favors, making them quiet enablers of the centuries-long genetic implosion. But here's where things start to twist. While the Habsburgs are the poster children for the dangers of inbreeding, not every medieval dynasty suffered the same grotesque fate. Some, like the Plantagenets or Valois, managed to mix their lineages enough to dodge total genetic collapse, at least for a while. Still, the risk was always lurking. One bad generation, one overly ambitious marriage, and boom, you're back on the slippery slope toward deformity and dynastic ruin. And the most brutal part? No one wanted to stop. Even as the signs became impossible to ignore, infant mortality, cognitive delays, miscarriages, families kept doubling down on the same strategy. Because the threat of losing power felt more terrifying than a few unfortunate births. They didn't see the problem until it was too late. And just when you think it couldn't get any more twisted. By the mid-1500s, the signs were everywhere. Babies born too weak to survive past infancy. Kings who couldn't speak clearly, read fluently, or even walk without assistance. Courts were whispering behind fans, doctors were panicking behind closed doors, but no one dared say it aloud. The dynasty was breaking down. And it wasn't because of war, plague, or rebellion. It was because they had run out of fresh blood. Let's go back to Charles II of Spain. His reign wasn't just medically tragic, it was a public catastrophe. From the moment he was born, it was clear something was wrong. He suffered seizures, chronic digestive issues, and could barely walk until age 4. His mental development lagged years behind his peers. By adulthood, Charles could hardly govern a village, let alone one of Europe's most powerful empires. His household hired dozens of attendants just to manage his bodily functions, feeding, dressing, even helping him speak. He was, quite literally, the product of centuries of royal inbreeding. And yet, instead of changing course, the Spanish court clung to him like he was their only hope. Because, in a way, he was. Charles was the last male of the Habsburg Spanish line. If he died childless, centuries of dynastic strategy would vanish overnight. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Despite 2 marriages, both to women who were related to him, naturally, Charles died in 1700 with no children. Spain was left in chaos. Multiple European powers rushed to lay claim to the throne, citing old family ties or hastily forged marriages. The result? The War of Spanish Succession, one of the deadliest conflicts of early modern Europe, all because a single bloodline collapsed under its own twisted weight. But this isn't just about Charles. All across Europe, similar patterns were unfolding. In Portugal, King Afonso VI, also from a deeply entangled royal bloodline, was born paralyzed on one side of his body and suffered from severe mental health issues. He was deposed by his own brother after a scandalous annulment trial revealed he couldn't consummate his marriage. Again, his genetic frailty wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of systemic inbreeding. Even outside of royalty, among lower nobility, cousin marriages were common. They kept estates intact, preserved alliances, and avoided messy external claims. But as medical knowledge advanced, so did the awareness of what these unions were doing to future generations. And still, tradition trumped science for centuries. Let's bring this home with a modern parallel. Imagine a billionaire family today where, generation after generation, cousins are encouraged, no, expected, to marry each other. Not for love, but for wealth preservation. The tabloids would lose their minds. Social services might get involved. Geneticists would throw red flags so fast they'd sprain a wrist. But in medieval and early modern Europe, that was just Tuesday. And here's another layer. Not everyone in the dynasty suffered equally. Many royals with milder inbreeding still functioned as charismatic, competent rulers. Philip II of Spain, for example, managed a global empire. Though his health was fragile, his mind was sharp. But every generation that continued the pattern increased the odds of rolling genetic snake eyes. Eventually, the flaws stopped being subtle. One of the most striking genetic consequences of this trend was the Habsburg jaw, a visible protrusion of the lower jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism. It became so exaggerated over generations that it was nearly diagnostic. You could recognize a Habsburg portrait from a mile away. The condition wasn't just aesthetic, it interfered with eating and speech, and it was directly linked to repeated consanguineous pairings. And it wasn't just jaws. Recessive disorders like hemophilia started appearing with greater frequency among Europe's elite. Mental health deteriorated in visible, public ways. Fertility dropped. Infant mortality soared. Dynasties that once seemed invincible were now teetering on the edge of self-destruction, and they had no one to blame but themselves. But denial is a powerful thing. Royal courts doubled down, brushing off concerns, silencing critics, and often blaming divine will. If a child was born deformed, it was God's punishment or a test of faith. Very few were willing to say the quiet part out loud. Maybe, just maybe, marrying your cousin isn't such a genius move. Some advisors did try to speak up. A few brave clerics, scholars, and doctors warned about the effects of mixing the same blood. One Spanish physician even wrote in the 1600s that repeated cousin marriages could lead to a generation of ghosts, living, but not truly alive. His work was buried, of course. It didn't fit the narrative. Still, not all monarchies ignored the warnings. The English crown, after centuries of intermarrying within Europe, began reaching out to foreign courts, seeking diversity in bloodlines. When Queen Victoria's descendants spread across Europe, they carried not only influence, but also the recessive gene for hemophilia. Ironically, the effort to diversify also spread hidden dangers more widely. And through all of this, the common people watched from the sidelines, sometimes in awe, often in horror. They couldn't afford to marry for politics. Their unions were usually local and pragmatic. And yet, they lived longer, healthier lives than many of their inbred rulers. Imagine the village blacksmith outliving the king by 30 years, because he married someone from the next town over instead of his cousin. By the late 1600s, the writing was on the wall. Courts could no longer hide the failures of their dynasties. But instead of changing tactics, many simply shifted blame, or quietly dissolved into extinction. The Habsburgs of Spain were gone. The Portuguese royal line weakened. The Bourbons took over, bringing fresh blood but also new baggage. So what happens when you mix power, desperation, and a refusal to look outside your own family tree? You get a dynasty that rots from the inside out. But the real horror? It wasn't just about one family's downfall. It was about the entire European system being built on a genetic time bomb, one that had just started ticking. By the 1700s, Europe had more than enough cautionary tales. The Spanish Habsburgs were extinct, the Portuguese throne teetered, and whispers of cursed bloodlines echoed through royal corridors. You'd think this would trigger a course correction, a royal reality check. But dynastic pride, that's a tough beast to kill. Instead of widespread reform, what we got was a patchy, often reluctant set of changes. In some courts, the strategy shifted from marrying first cousins to marrying second or third cousins, barely any better genetically, but just enough to give the illusion of change. Others simply imported new blood from equally entangled noble houses. It was like swapping out rotten apples for slightly less moldy ones. Take the Bourbons, who replaced the Habsburgs on the Spanish throne. They brought fresh genetics from France, but it was hardly a clean break. The Bourbon family tree still looped in familiar ways. And despite their fresh start, the same political pressures persisted. Marry advantageously, keep lands intact, protect the bloodline. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits are tied to power, prestige, and paranoia. But in a few rare corners of Europe, Enlightenment ideas began to take root. Scholars started publicly questioning whether noble blood was really superior, or just better at hiding disease for a few generations. Philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu mocked the aristocracy's obsession with lineage, hinting that perhaps marrying outside the noble caste might produce stronger, healthier heirs. The idea was radical, unthinkable, even, but it planted a seed. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa, mother of Marie Antoinette, did try to space out cousin marriages in her sprawling brood of 16 children. She arranged marriages across broader European lines and occasionally even let love match strategy. Still, most of her daughters were married to cousins, uncles, or nephews in some form. The reforms were cosmetic at best. And over in Russia, the Romanovs were still tangled deep in the cousin web. Tsar Nicholas II married Princess Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Their son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, yet another genetic curse passed down through Europe's most noble line. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the same old pattern, playing out under new banners. But let's zoom out. Why was this pattern so hard to break? Simple. Power made it logical. For centuries, everything, land, law, loyalty, was tied to blood. Blood was proof. Blood was leverage. Blood was currency. The fewer people who shared your blood, the more valuable yours became. That logic didn't just fuel inbreeding, it justified it. Imagine today if a corporation said, "We only promote employees who are direct relatives of the CEO." People would riot. Lawsuits would rain down. HR would implode. But in medieval and early modern Europe, that was the baseline. Not promoting family first would be seen as betrayal, weakness, or even treason. And even when the physical symptoms of inbreeding were obvious, they were rationalized away. A king couldn't speak. He was contemplative. A queen couldn't produce heirs. God's will. A prince had seizures or hallucinations. He was touched by divine vision. The truth, hereditary disease, was too dangerous to admit, because to admit that your blood was broken meant admitting your claim to rule was broken too. Still, cracks kept forming. One by one, dynasties began to unravel, not just biologically, but socially. In France, the Bourbon dynasty seemed stable until the revolution exploded. Centuries of cousin-marrying aristocrats suddenly looked less like wise rulers and more like out-of-touch elites trapped in a self-made echo chamber. The public wasn't just angry about taxes, they were disgusted by the lavish weddings between relatives, the children who couldn't walk, and the sense that royalty had become a genetic joke. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, the guillotine didn't just cut off their heads, it severed the idea that noble blood was inherently superior. Suddenly, birth didn't guarantee fitness to rule. In fact, it seemed to guarantee quite the opposite. And yet, even then, the lesson wasn't fully learned. After Napoleon's defeat, Europe went right back to reinstalling old bloodlines. The Bourbons returned. The Habsburgs still ruled parts of Central Europe. And cousin marriage, still in fashion. Even Queen Victoria, who reigned over one of the most modern empires of her day, encouraged cousin marriage among her children, spreading hemophilia like wildfire through Europe's royal courts. One of the most tragic examples. Russia's Prince Alexei, heir to the Romanov dynasty. His illness turned his mother, Alexandra, into a desperate believer in mysticism. Enter Rasputin. The mad monk's influence over the royal family, thanks to his supposed healing powers, helped destroy public trust in the monarchy. Again, trace it back, and it all leads to one thing: inbreeding. By the early 20th century, the damage was done. Multiple monarchies collapsed in World War I, taking centuries of dynastic scheming down with them. The Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Romanovs in Russia, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, gone. And though war, revolution, and politics played the loudest roles, genetic decline whispered in the background, eroding these houses from within. Even the surviving royals started to change their tune. Marrying commoners became less scandalous. Genetic counseling became a thing. Bloodlines stopped being gospel and started being a liability. But here's the kicker: all of this could have been avoided. Had medieval dynasties looked beyond their own halls, beyond their fear of losing land or legacy, they might have built stronger, more stable realms. But instead, they stayed locked in the same deadly loop: power through blood and death by the same. And the worst part? Some families knew the risk and did it anyway. Because sometimes, the fear of dilution is stronger than the fear of destruction. By the late 19th century, Europe was still wearing crowns, but the gold was starting to tarnish. The public no longer bowed instinctively. The idea that rulers were chosen by God had started to seem quaint, almost ridiculous. And the more people learned about royal health, the more the whole system looked like a dangerously overbred dog show. Inbreeding wasn't just causing genetic problems, it was becoming political dynamite. When Queen Victoria's grandchildren married into nearly every ruling house in Europe, she earned the nickname Grandmother of Europe. But what nobody wanted to talk about was the ticking genetic time bomb she helped plant across the continent. Hemophilia was the most infamous legacy. It spread from Victoria's line into the Russian Romanovs, the Spanish Bourbons, and the German Prussians. The disorder didn't just cause pain, it caused scandal, secrecy, and desperation. Royal families tried to hide it, fearing that any sign of weakness could be exploited by political enemies. And they weren't wrong. In Russia, when Alexei Romanov's condition was discovered, it shattered the illusion of strength at the very top of the empire. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, clung to Rasputin because he seemed to ease Alexei's suffering, an act that opened the gates to court corruption, public outrage, and revolutionary fury. The image of the Romanovs as divinely appointed rulers was replaced with one of sickness, superstition, and incompetence. One bleeding child. One mystic healer. One empire toppled. It's wild to think about, but a single genetic disorder, passed down through royal inbreeding, contributed to the fall of the 300-year-old Russian monarchy. And that wasn't the only one. In Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire was already wobbling under the weight of nationalist tensions, industrial strain, and imperial bloat. But internally, the bloodline was exhausted. Emperor Franz Joseph had ruled for decades, but his heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, suffered from severe depression, possibly exacerbated by genetic predisposition. His suicide in 1889 at Mayerling sent shockwaves through the empire and left the line of succession thin and unstable. The next heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, wasn't even the favorite of the court. He had married for love, not political strategy, and his children were barred from inheriting the throne. So when he was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, the event triggered World War I not just because of politics, but because there were no backup plans. The bloodline was too narrow. There was no wiggle room left. And in Spain, King Alfonso XIII, grandson of Queen Victoria, inherited both the throne and the hemophilia gene. He fathered sons with the condition, and the dynasty became a medical tragedy wrapped in royal ceremony. Eventually, the Spanish monarchy would collapse into republicanism, then dictatorship, then constitutional restoration, all while limping along with the echoes of its genetic past. All of this, revolutions, assassinations, wars, wasn't caused solely by inbreeding, of course. But it played a haunting role. It created fragile heirs, unpredictable leaders, and court dynamics so paranoid they made Game of Thrones look tame. Imagine if Fortune 500 CEOs were all cousins with heart defects, mood disorders, and no succession plans. That's what Europe looked like at the dawn of the 20th century. A continent run by families who'd walled themselves off for so long, they couldn't see the collapse coming until it was too late. And while all this chaos was unfolding in royal palaces, the world outside was changing fast. Democracy was rising. Science was exploding. Public health was becoming a thing. The idea of eugenics, a dangerous, pseudo-scientific offshoot of genetics, was gaining traction in elite circles. Ironically, the same royals who had long ignored genetic risk were now being used as case studies for genetic degeneration. Some scientists of the time pointed to European royalty as proof of why selective breeding could be dangerous when done wrong. They didn't advocate outbreeding as a solution. They jumped to sterilization, racial hierarchies, and social engineering. The tragic irony. The same obsession with blood purity that had doomed royal houses now poisoned modern science. But the people, they were done. By the end of World War I, four major monarchies had collapsed. The Russian Romanovs were executed. The German Kaiser abdicated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fragmented. The Ottoman Sultanate fell. All gone within a few years. And the ones that survived, they started marrying down. The British royal family began courting aristocrats and even commoners. The Swedish and Danish courts introduced new blood. Genetic counseling started, quietly, becoming part of royal planning. Slowly, deliberately, the old rules were tossed out. Love, personality, even health started to matter more than ancestry charts. And still, shadows of the old ways lingered. When Charles, Prince of Wales, married Lady Diana Spencer, the world celebrated a modern fairy tale. But behind the scenes, aristocratic lineage still mattered, just in more PR-friendly packaging. Even today, royal marriages are scrutinized for heritage, compatibility, and breeding potential. It's just not called that anymore. What remains undeniable is this: the centuries of inbreeding didn't just create weak heirs. They helped bring down empires. And the most bitter truth of all? These collapses didn't come from outside invasions, famines, or enemy plots. They came from within, from royal families that clung so tightly to their own blood that they poisoned their own legacy. In the end, it wasn't betrayal or rebellion that brought down Europe's greatest dynasties. It was biology. By the early 20th century, the royal houses of Europe weren't just losing power, they were losing credibility. The world was industrializing, modernizing, democratizing, and yet the crown still clung to the same old blood logic. Marry close, preserve the line, protect the name. But what happens when that very name becomes a curse? The myth that noble blood equaled noble strength was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. For centuries, blood had been currency. Now, it was liability. Let's rewind to a figure we've met before, Charles II of Spain. He was never meant to carry an empire, yet centuries of calculated cousin marriages dumped the full weight of the Spanish monarchy on his frail, malformed shoulders. His reign wasn't a blip, it was a warning siren. And yet, that warning was ignored. Across Europe, rulers kept drawing from the same shallow gene pool. Different crown, same mistake. And it wasn't just about hemophilia or the Habsburg jaw anymore. The real danger was subtler and far more corrosive. It was the system-wide inability to adapt. When everyone around you has the same surname and the same mindset, innovation dies. Fear replaces strategy. The family circle tightens into a noose. By the 1910s, the cracks were now fault lines. In Russia, the Romanovs bled, literally and figuratively, until there was nothing left. In Austria-Hungary, a single assassination shattered a fragile, inbred empire. In Germany, the old aristocracy stood paralyzed in a modern war. Everywhere you looked, royal houses had become too slow, too sickly, too self-absorbed to survive the world they once ruled. And yet, many of them still didn't get it. Even as war ended monarchies, some remaining royals clung to the illusion of legacy. Some looked at the ruins of cousin marriage and asked, "But was it really that bad?" It's the same blindness that led to their downfall in the first place, an inability to distinguish tradition from decay. Now zoom out. This wasn't just a royal problem, it was a lesson in how any elite system, left unchecked, can rot from within. When leadership is passed only to those born into it, when preservation matters more than evolution, collapse becomes inevitable. What medieval Europe shows us, brutally, vividly, is what happens when a lie about strength becomes a truth about weakness. But here's the twist. Just as everything began to unravel, a new idea took root. That leadership doesn't have to be inherited. That greatness isn't guaranteed by genealogy. That sometimes, to protect a legacy, you have to break it. It started small. Royals began marrying outside aristocracy. Heirs received modern medical care and psychological support. Genealogy charts were still kept, but genetic risk was no longer ignored. Quietly, royal families began to value resilience over pedigree. Some even welcomed commoners, shocking at the time, but inevitable in hindsight. Still, the scars remain. Many of today's European royal houses bear names that were once synonymous with decline. Their castles echo with portraits of deformed heirs, failed marriages, childless kings. They've become caretakers of history, reminders of what happens when power is hoarded and blood becomes obsession. And yet, the full reckoning still lingers. Because while the symptoms of dynastic inbreeding have faded, the instinct behind it, fear of change, fear of outsiders, fear of losing control, hasn't gone anywhere. It just wears different clothes now. That's why this story matters. Not just because of who ruled or how they fell, but because it shows what happens when power becomes an inheritance instead of a responsibility. When identity is defined by ancestry, not actions. When protecting a name matters more than protecting the people behind it. So we end with this, not a collapse, not a coronation, but a reckoning still unfolding. We like to think we've come a long way from the dark halls of medieval castles, but the story of royal inbreeding reminds us just how fragile power can be when it's trapped in a loop of fear and tradition. Centuries of cousin marriage didn't make Europe's dynasties stronger, they made them slower, sicker, and doomed to fall. So here's the question. If bloodlines can crumble the greatest empires in history, what does that say about the way we choose our leaders today? Should legacy still matter more than merit? Let us know what shocked you most in the comments, and if you'd survive a royal bloodline. Don't forget to subscribe for more brutally honest history every week, right here on Medieval Daily.